Chances are you'll see a few silver-colored mercury fillings. But if you have more than 4, there may be cause for concern. A new report prepared for Health Canada warns that depending on your age and the number of fillings you have, mercury amalgam, as it's called, could have health risks. Dr. Mark Richardson is the author of the report, and he joins me now from Ottawa. Hello, Dr. Richardson.
Hello.
Thanks for taking time out to speak to us today.
No problem.
Now, what are these health risks associated with mercury amalgam?
There's evidence that exposure to mercury vapor at low levels causes effects on the central nervous system. These include mostly effects on cognitive function, reaction time, short-term memory, hand-eye coordination, that sort of thing. They're very subtle effects, and they take fairly exacting methods to detect. You can't do it on an individual basis. You have to look at groups of people who are exposed compared to those who aren't and compare them statistically. But there's evidence that mercury exposure causes those kinds of effects.
How would the mercury get from the filling into the body to cause the effects?
Amalgam fillings are 50% more or less mercury by weight. And mercury constantly evaporates or volatilizes from the amalgam filling throughout the length of time it happens to be in your mouth. And you inhale that when you breathe in through your mouth, and it's absorbed in your lungs and distributed through your body.
Now, what made you decide, or what evidence do you have to decide that the cutoff number is 4 for adults? Why not 6? Why not 3? Why 4?
Well, the reasoning goes like this. The effects that I mentioned that mercury causes, I attempted to estimate the threshold for those effects. Now, the research that's published in the scientific literature do not indicate or haven't yet detected the level of exposure to mercury vapor at which those effects do not occur. In most of the studies that are reported in the literature, there are effects in all those exposed. So I had to try and extrapolate back from that data to determine what the threshold of those effects are, at what level are they unlikely to occur.
So what you did was you looked at people who did have effects and then tried to figure out what would happen, how much you would need not to have any effects.
That's right.
How did you extrapolate that?
Well, it's a fairly simple procedure. You take a key study that you feel has been done in the most valid fashion, and then you derive from that, in this case, a lowest observed adverse effect level, and as I've mentioned already, what the adverse effects were that I was identifying. From that, you divide that number, that concentration or that dose of mercury by an uncertainty factor that accounts for what you don't know about the study or don't know about the substance. And in this case, we know that we didn't identify or couldn't identify a threshold for the effect. And we also know that there's a certain amount of variation in response from one individual to another. So trying to account for those, that lowest observed effect concentration was reduced to the concentration, or the dose mentioned is 0.014 micrograms per kilogram body weight per day.
And that effect that you were looking at, what was it? It
was a collection of effects. The study involved measurement of, in this case, hand tremor and some other effects. And the dose associated with those effects was approximately 26 micrograms of mercury per cubic meter of air. It was an air concentration, and I had to recalculate or estimate that as a dose as opposed to a concentration in air so that I could compare it to the effects or to the doses of mercury received from amalgam fillings.
Now, this dose wasn't coming from fillings, it was coming from somewhere else?
Yes, the study on which the tolerable daily intake, or this reference dose, was based are occupational studies of mercury exposure, in particular inhalation of mercury vapor in the work environment. There are no studies done looking at these subtle neurological effects in people with amalgam versus those without, so I had to resort to that occupational literature. But I will mention that mercury vapor is mercury vapor regardless of the source it might come from, and inhalation of that regardless of the source should result in the same effect.
So you don't see any problem with finding mercury from another source and extrapolating that to mercury from the fillings?
No, not at all.
What the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, looked at past studies of occupational mercury exposure and amalgam, and they came up with the fact that there were no health risks associated with it. Where's the evidence that you found that there is a health risk?
Well, We took two completely different approaches. The previous studies that have been done, Sweden has also done one, they looked at the available information that related to clinical illness of people with amalgam only, along with some animal studies related specifically to amalgam. That's a very, very small database, and the clinical effects that have been investigated, such as cancer, I think diabetes as well, and a number of others, are not effects actually I would expect to see in people who have amalgam and the doses of mercury exposure associated with those fillings. So I took a different approach, and I applied a very standard risk assessment model that's used in environmental risk assessment all the time. You try to estimate what is an acceptable or tolerable level of exposure, and then you calculate or quantify what is the exposure from the source you're worried about. In this case, it was amalgam. And then I just compared the two. And was the dose from amalgam equal to, less than, or more than this reference dose?
So you're saying they were looking at the wrong symptoms. You think the symptoms you're looking at are more accurate?
I think it's important to recognize, or I should make the point, that there aren't widespread clinical illness associated with having amalgam. I have 15 amalgam fillings in my mouth, and I hope I'm not ill. But the subtle effects, which I've discussed from the scientific literature, are what you might term subclinical. You couldn't walk into a doctor's office or into a hospital and have them diagnosed. They're very, very slight, and you have to look at statistical differences between a group that's exposed and a group that isn't in order to detect them.
So should that study be done eventually, do you think? Is that the kind of study that's in the next step?
I would hope that study might be done. Certainly the committee that met yesterday to discuss my report, that particular issue was brought up, that there was a need probably to do that study.
So with that, what should people who have fillings do right now? You said you have 15. I have about 15 in my head, and I'm sure a lot of people watching have a lot. What should we do?
Well, I can only say, I'll put it on a personal note. I have 15 filled teeth. I'm not going out tomorrow to have them all removed, but I am, as they require replacement, and they do from time to time, every year or two I have to have one or two replaced, I will be looking at some of those alternate materials in order to reduce my own personal exposure to mercury, which, based on the study that I did, would be sizable, and I would predict that for myself, I probably exceed that reference dose on a daily basis based on the number of amalgam fillings I have.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Richardson. It was nice talking to you.
I hope it was clear.
It was very clear.
Okay.
Dr. Mark Richardson is the author of the report on mercury amalgam fillings and health effects.